Hey friends, what up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're starting masechet Sukkah. So, daf Sukkah, masechet Sukkah, daf Beis. Daf 2 of masechet Sukkah, friends. So we're starting masechet Sukkah. Sukkah, of course, talks about like the festival of Sukkot, and the first perek, I think even the first two parakim, talks about like actual construction of a sukkah, which is cool and exciting because it's like how you build your sukkah. There are going to be certain connections to Masechta Eruvin in terms of mechitzas and the halachas of mechitza and math and stuff like that at certain points. But I think that what makes it different when it comes to sukkah is though it's a kind of, it's funny, it's kind of like exciting and it's practical, whereas Eruvin was like just kind of technical and it's like, okay, but like Lemaisa, we don't really make Eruvs. Sukkah you really do, everybody makes their own sukkah, and therefore many of these halachas actually really do become relevant because, people are making sukkahs in all sorts of interesting places and all sorts of interesting ways. So it is kind of interesting. Anyway, so we're going to jump in at the beginning of Masechta Sukkah, discussing what are sort of the things that make a kosher sukkah. Particularly, we will be discussing the maximum height of a sukkah, machlokas over there, and then the source of why sukkah has to be within a certain height range. So, let us begin at the beginning of Masechta Sukkah with the new Mishnah. Sukkah, shikavaya l'mayla me'esrim amma psula. A sukkah that is taller than 20 amas is too tall. It's possible. Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Rabbi Yehuda says no, it's fine. And if it is not even 10 tfachim tall, that's pretty short. 10 tfachim, 10 like fist height. Take your fist, take its height, times 10. Not that tall. If it doesn't have 3 walls, so it doesn't have to have 4 walls, it has to have 3 walls. And we're going to learn that really it just has to have 2 walls and a third wall that is just 1 tefach. Right? So it needs to have 3 walls. And if there is more sun than shade, right? Meaning if you put up schach on top of the sukkah, but you don't put up that much schach, it's kind of sparsely scattered and there's actually more space, more sun getting through than there is actual shade, well then as Rashi points out, then the actual schach then is going to be batel berov, and it'll be like there's no schach at all, and it's called a sukkah. Sukkah is schach, right? And therefore the main thing of the sukkah is really the schach, and if there's more sun than there is shade, then the shade becomes batel, becomes like nullified to the space, to the sun, and it's as if it's not there at all, and that's a problem. Givaldig. Zok the Gemara Tanan Hasam. We learned over there in Masechta Eruvin. Mavui shogavo me'esrim amo yimoit. Rav Yehuda Omer eino tzarich. It says in the context of a mavui. Friends, you remember what a mavui is? Obviously you do. A mavui, but I guess I'll mention it just for a shtickle review. Mavui is, remember, they would the way that they would organize their houses, they would have a chotzer, which is like a courtyard, and in the courtyard you have a whole bunch of houses. So one courtyard, lots of houses that open up into that courtyard. Now, then the courtyards were organized so that several courtyards would open up into a shared mavui. And by way of the mavui, which is some kind of like alleyway connecting the different courtyards, you would then go out to Rosh Hashanah. And Midar Abanon, the rabbi said that since this mavui is a shared space for all of the different chutzers, and by way of this shared space you go out to Rosh Hashanah, it's very similar to being Rosh Hashanah, and out of concern that people might make a mistake and carry from the mavui, which Midoraisa is a Rosh Hashanah, into the Rosh Hashanah, although I think that there were different svaras, right? One of them was to make sure that you don't go out. What was the other one? Were there other svaras? One was to make sure that you don't go from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah. I feel like there was another svara. I can't remember. Anyways, so therefore they said, put up either a lechi, which is like a pole of sorts that stands vertically by the entrance, or a korah, which is like a cross beam that goes from one wall to the other on the open side of the mavui. So now, assuming that it is a mavui sasum as opposed to a mavui amefulash, right? Assuming that it's closed on three sides. So now, we have machlokas masechta eruvin that if this crossbeam that goes from one wall to the other at the opening of the mavui, if the crossbeam is higher than 20 amas from the ground, so the chacham say you have to lower it, whereas Rabbi Yehuda says you don't have to lower it. So for the Gemara, ma'ishnogabi sukkah detani psula, ma'ishnogabi mavui detani takanta. How come when it comes to sukkah we just said sukkah shigavol l'mal me'esmama psula? If you have a sukkah that's taller than 20 amas, it's mamish no good. It's bad. It's pasul. It's invalid. But when it comes to mavui, we don't say that the mavui is invalid. We just say you have to lower the beam. So how come when it comes to sukkah it says it's invalid, and when it comes to mavui it says just lower it, just fix it, no big deal? And for the Gemara, sukkah d'oraisa tani psula mavui d'rabbanan tani takanta. Well, there's a difference. Sukkah is a mitzvah d'oraisa. Mavui is a din d'rabbanan. So when it comes to Rashi explains it in an interesting way, in a nice way. Kilu sukkah is d'oraisa, which means that kilu even before this Mishnah came around, it was already a halacha. We didn't make this up. It was a din d'oraisa. The Eibishter said you have to make a sukkah, and if you don't make it in a certain way, if you make it in improper way, it's invalid. Whereas when it comes to mavui is d'rabbanan, which means that kilu the rabbis are making up the halacha, so to speak. So kilu, who's to say that it's invalid? Invalid since when? Invalid since we decided to say that it's invalid. So kilu, technically speaking, it's not really invalid, right? It's just from this point on, we say that now that we want you to put up a korah or a lechi, we want you to put it up in a certain way, and if you didn't put it up in that way, it's not invalid, so to speak, because midoraisa it's kosher. But fix it so that you can be doing it in the way that we want you to be doing it. So therefore, when it comes to sukkah, which is mitzvah d'oraisa, so it says pasul, it says invalid. When it comes to mavui, which is or korah, which is d'rabbanan, so they say, look, if you didn't do it properly, just fix it. Okay. Vibai say more if you want, I will say. But the Raisa nami tani takanto. Or you could say, no, you can also say fix it in the context of deoraisis. Even if you have something that's mitzvah deoraisa, if you don't do it the right way, you could still fix it theoretically. Okay, so and how come by sukkah it says pasul and not takanta? So sukkah dinafish milse pasuk vitani psula. Mavui de lo nafish milse tani takanta. So the Gemara says, but there's just a technical difference, which is that in our Mishnah by Sukkah, there's a lot of different things going on. It's talking about the maximum height of a Sukkah. It's talking about the minimum height of a Sukkah. It's talking about how many walls it has to have. It's talking about if there's more sun than shade in the schach. And therefore, if you would start going into how to fix each thing, it would become shtickle spaghetti. If it's too tall, lower it. If it's too short, raise it. If it doesn't have enough walls, add walls. If there's too much sun, add schach. There would be too many things to go into. They say, you know what? Look, these are the halachas. If you don't do it this way, pasul, that's that. Instead of going into all the intricacies. Whereas when it comes to mavui, it's talking about one thing. Mavui, if it's too tall, fix it. That's it. So therefore, it was easier to say fix it in the case of a mavui. Right? Just, you might lower it. So it was easier to sort of explain how to fix it in the context of a mavui, whereas when it comes to sukkah, if you're going to start talking about how to fix each thing, it's going to become a mess, so we just say one word, pasul, and we move on. And as Rashi points out, that when it comes to Eruvin, it says, mavui lo nafish mile ba'osa Mishnah. Rashi points out that, mavui doesn't have a lot of halachas in that particular Mishnah, but don't get the wrong idea. Mavui does have a lot of halachas, as we all know. How do we know that a sukkah needs to be a certain height? How do we know that the maximum height of a sukkah is 20 amas? That the Torah says that so that your children will know, that your generations, future generations will know that I supplied sukkahs with Anonei Kavod for the Bnei Yisrael when they left Egypt. So it says, L'man yedu dorseichem, that your future generation should know. Ad esum ama adam yodea shudar b'sukkah l'malim esum ama ein adam yodea shudar b'sukkah mishum d'lo shalta ba'ena. You hear that, Chaver? Let's read it again. Ad esum ama, until 20 amas, adam yodea shudar b'sukkah. As long as the sukkah is within 20 amas, as long as the schach is within 20 amas of the ground, so you know that you're sitting in a sukkah. However, l'maylim esum ama, if the schach is higher than 20 amas off of the ground, ein adam yodea shadar b'sukkah. You don't realize that you're sitting in a sukkah b'chlal shmishum d'lo shalta ba'ena. You don't see the schach. And since if it's too tall, you don't see the schach, so then it's not a kosher sukkah. You have to know that you're sitting in a sukkah. If it's too tall, you don't know that. Reb Zera Omar mehacha. Reb Zera says from here, v'sukkati l'tzel yoma mechorek, that the pasuk says in Yeshaya that in the future the Eibishter will build like a chuppah, and it will be l'tzel yoma mechorek, that it will be a shade, that the sukkah will be a shade from the heat. Adesum ama adam yoshev b'tzel sukkah l'malim esum ama ein adam yoshev b'tzel sukkah l'b'tzel defanos, that until 20 amas tall, a fellow is sitting under the shade of the schach. However, if the sukkah is taller than 20 amas, then the fellow is not, the shade that the fellow is sitting under is not the shade of the schach, it's the shade of the walls. If it's 20 amas tall, then memele, it's the walls that are that's providing the shade. The schach is too tall, it's not providing you any shade. And as we're going to learn, that's also, dependent on if the width, if the inner space of the sukkah is within a certain amount. But if, of course, if the inner space of the sukkah is wide enough, well then even if it's taller than 20 amas, then potentially you're still sitting under the shade of the schach. But okay, that's Reb Zera's opinion. Right? It says, v'sukkati l'tzel yomam, that the sukkah is for shade, and that within 20 amas, a fellow is sitting under the shade of the schach. Above 20 amas, the fellow is sitting under the shade of the walls. Amalei Abaye says to Reb Zera, if it's all about shade of the schach, well then elameata ho'os sukasu b'ashtros kanaim. If a fellow makes a sukkah in a valley where there's tall mountains around him, and memele, the shade that he's enjoying is not coming from his sukkah, it's not coming from the schach, it's coming from the mountains that surround him. Would you suggest that wouldn't be a kosher sukkah? Because memele, the shade that he's sitting under is not from the schach, it's technically coming from the mountains surrounding. To which Reb Zera responds, that would be a kosher sukkah, because in that case, if you were to remove the mountains, you would have a kosher sukkah. The sukkah in a vacuum, the sukkah itself is a kosher sukkah. So within 20 amas, you're sitting under the shade of the schach. Technically speaking, in this particular case, since there are mountains around, I understand the question, right? You're concerned that maybe, technically speaking, you're not sitting under the shade of the schach, you're sitting under the shade of the mountains. But if you were to remove the mountains, you'd have a completely kosher sukkah. Hacha, whereas if you have a sukkah that's taller than 20 amas, dal defanis, if you remove the walls, which are what's providing the shade, leketzel sukkah, you still are not going to be sitting under the shade of the schach, because the sunlight is going to be coming through the sides underneath the schach. And therefore, says Reb Zera, a sukkah needs to be within 20 amas, because that is the only way that you'll be sitting under the shade of the schach. Fine. Virava Omer says, Rava mehacha, that the source for 20 amas comes from here, Basukas Tezru Shivas Yomim, that the Torah says for 7 days sit in a sukkah. Amr Torah kol Shivas Yom tzei midir eskeva v'shev midir esarai. Says Rava that the Torah says that we want that over the course of a week, for 7 days, leave your permanent structure and live in a temporary structure. Ad esum ama adam osa dirasu dirasarai, that as long as the sukkah is less than 20 amas, a fellow could make it in a temporary way. However, a structure that is taller than 20 amas tall, about 30 feet tall, so you can't really make that in a temporary way. In order to build a structure that's 20 amas tall, you're going to have to build it in a more permanent way. And the point is that a sukkah needs to be a temporary dwelling. And therefore, you have to build it less than 20 amas tall so that you can build it in a temporary way. Abaye asks Rava, Abaye, and he says, Rava, if it's all about making a temporary structure, well, let me ask you a kasha. You could make a permanent structure less than 20 amas tall, right? Meaning, Rava, if you're saying that the whole point of under 20 amas is so that you'll have a temporary dwelling, well, what if you build a sukkah that's 10 amas tall? Easily within the proper height, but you make it out of barzel, out of iron. You make iron walls. Mamash, a very sturdy structure. Mamash, a house. And then you put tzchach on top. So Rava, would you suggest that would be posel sukkah because the walls are permanent? Why should it be posel? It's within 20 amas. It's got tzchach on top. So Rava says, this is what I mean. Rava says, no, what I mean is this. Generally speaking, up until 20 amas, a person can make a temporary structure. If a fellow wants to make the walls out of iron so that they're particularly sturdy, whereas a structure that is taller than 20 amas, in order to construct it, you really have to make the walls permanent. You have to make proper foundations. You have to make the walls strong and sturdy. It's a very tall structure. You don't want it to fall down and topple and be dangerous. So therefore, says Rava, when you have a sukkah that's taller than 20 amas, you really have to make it pretty sturdy. And even if you manage to chaparine and make it temporary, it doesn't matter. It's going to be posel. However, a sukkah that is less than 20 amas tall, where you really can make it in a temporary way, if you want to make it in a permanent way, gesundheit. That is why Rava says that the source, right? So Rava says that the source for 20 amas comes from that you want to build a structure that's really meant for just a week, a temporary structure. And generally speaking, temporary can, bigadol as a general rule be defined as something that's within 20 amas. You will build in a, is easily buildable in a temporary fashion. Now, Zok the Gemara kulu kirabelo amre hahu yediyah l'dayrasi. So now the Gemara is saying, how come Reb Zera and Rava disagree with Rabba? The answer being that they'll say that pasuk of so that your future generations will know that I made these sukkahs, let's say, for the Yidden when they left Egypt. That's talking about future generations, so that the future generations will know that the Eibishter gave us sukkahs when we left, right? Which I believe are the Anonei HaKavod. He gave us the Anonei HaKavod when we left Egypt, but it has nothing to do with building a sukkah for the festival of Sukkahs. Reb Zera na'ami lo ameh, and Rabba and Rava disagree with Reb Zera because Ahuli Moshe Mashiach u'dichsev. Because that pasuk of V'sukkotiyah l'tzel yom, it's a pasuk in Yeshaya that talks about the Moshe Mashiach, that the Eibishter is going to make a chuppah for us, and it's going to be gevaldig. Nothing to do with the festival of Sukkot. Reb Zera will respond to that accusation. Reb Zera says, yeah, but if all it was saying is that in the future the Eibishter is going to make us a chuppah and it's going to be gevaldig, so then it should say that this canopy that the Eibishter will create will be for shade in the from the heat, and if it's very rainy and wet, it'll protect us from that as well. How come Dafka the pasuk in Yishai goes out of its way to say v'sukkah tiyeh l'tzal yomim and not v'chuppah tiyeh l'tzal yom? Because it's to teach us that a sukkah is something that provides shade. Meaning it's a double meaning. One is to say, yes, the Eibishter is going to make us this canopy, it's going to be mamash gaval. But it doesn't say v'chuppah tiyeh l'tzal yom, it says v'sukkah tiyeh l'tzal yom, to teach us another halacha, which is that Davka, a sukkah is something that provides shade. So therefore, Mimele, says Reb Zera, when you're sitting in a sukkah, you have to be sitting in the shade of the schach. If it's taller than 20 amas, you're sitting in the shade of the walls. Ki Rav Nami lo amrei, and Reb Zera and Rabba are unwilling to hold like Rava, who says it's about being temporary, mishum kushid Abaye, because of the question of Abaye, that, what if you build a permanent structure within 20 amas? Fine. So now we're going to bring three statements of Rav, really of students of Rav, quoting in the name of Rav. And we're going to try to figure out, like, which of the Amoraim, like Rabba, Reb Zera, or Rava, could this statement be consistent with. Machlokas b'she'ein defanos magios l'schach. You hear that? Says Rabbi Yoshi in the name of Rav that the machlokas between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda about does the sukkah have to be within 20 amas or not? Rabbi Yehuda says no, it doesn't. The Chacham say yes, it does. Says Rabbi Yoshi in the name of Rav that this machlokas is only when the walls do not reach all the way up to the schach, when there's air, when there's space between the top of the walls and the schach. They don't reach all the way up to the schach. But if the walls are touching the schach, they go all the way up and touch the schach, well then even if it's higher than 20 amas, it's fine. You hear that? So it says Rabbi Yoshi in the name of Rav that this machlokes between the Tanakam and Rabbi Yehuda is only when the walls don't reach all the way to the schach. In that case, the Chacham say that the sukkah has to be within 20 amas. However, if the walls reach all the way up to the schach, well then it can even be taller than 20 amas, kiman kirabba. Well that's like Rabba, the Amr Mishum Dilo Shalta Ba'ena. That Rabba says that the reason for 20 amas is l'man yedu dorosechem, so your future generations will know that they're sitting in a sukkah. And since the walls reach all the way to the schach, so even if it's taller than 20 amas, you'll still follow the walls up to the schach, and you'll see the schach, and you'll know that you're sitting in a sukkah. And therefore Rabbi Yoshio says in the name of Rav that the machlokes is only when the walls do not reach the schach. That's like Rabbah. Because Rabbah would say, in that case, the Chacham say, look, since the walls don't reach the schach, and the schach is so high off the ground, you're not even going to notice it, you won't know that you're in a sukkah. However, if the walls reach the schach, you just follow your eyes, memele, follow the walls, and then they hit the schach, and you realize that you're sitting in a sukkah. Like, who does the following statement of Rav Huna in the name of Rav go like? That the machlokas between the Tanakam and Rabbi Yehuda is only when the sukkah is less than 4 amas by 4 amas. In that case, the Chacham say it has to be within 20 amas. Tall. But if the sukkah is larger than 4 amas by 4 amas, in terms of its length and its width, even if it's taller than 20 amas, it's fine. That's like Reb Zera, who says about the shade, right? Reb Zera's opinion is that that the Chacham say that the sukkah has a maximum height of 20 amas because you have to sit under the shade of the schach. And if the sukkah is too tall, you're not sitting under the shade of the schach, you're sitting under the shade of the walls. However, we're saying over here, according to Rav Huna, that if the sukkah is larger than 4 amas by 4 amas, well then even if it's taller than 20 amas, you could still be sitting under the shade of the schach, not under the shade of the walls. I guess it's a mathematical, I didn't do the math, but I guess it's a mathematical calculation that memele, if the sukkah is larger than 4x4, so then even if it's taller than 20 amas, you could still be sitting under the schach and not under the walls, the shade of the walls. Since the sukkah is large enough, it's wide enough, so then you could still be sitting under the shade of the schach, even if it's taller than 20 amas. Like who does the following statement of Rav Chanan bar Rabba in the name of Rav go like machlokas b'sheina machzekes elekidei rosh avuba v'shulchano, that the machlokas between the Tanakam and Rabbi Yehuda is when the sukkah is very small, so small that you can only fit in kidei rosh avuba v'shulchano. The sukkah is so small that you can only fit in your head, not even your entire body, most of your body, as Rashi points out, of course, that they used to eat leaning. So he would be lying on a couch and like his feet would be sticking out of his sukkah. And he can get his table in there as well, right next to his bed that he's leaning on. His couch that he's leaning on. So, it says, Rav Chanan bar Rabba, that the machlokas about does the sukkah have to be within 20 amas or not, is only when the sukkah is like a very, very small sukkah. You can only fit in your head, most of your body, and your table. But if the sukkah is larger than that, even if it's taller than 20 amas, then it is kosher commandelo kechad. It's like none of them. Because even Reb Zera would still say that if it's larger than Rosh Ruba v'Shulchano, you're still going to be sitting under the shade of the walls, not the shade of the schach, and it's not, according to Rava, you're still going to have to be permanent if it's taller than 20 amas, and according to Rabbah, you wouldn't know that you're sitting in a sukkah because it's too tall. Fine. So it's not like any of them. Now, Zok Gemara, V'shlomo Rabbi Yoshe pligad Rav Huna Rav Chanan bar Rabba. So I understand that Rabbi Yoshe's opinion, which is that the machlokas is when the walls do not reach the sukkah, the schach. So he kind of has a different mahalach than Rav Huna and Rav Chanan bar Rabba, that they're saying that the machlokas is based on sort of the size of the sukkah, right? Is it Rosh Ruba v'Shulchano? Is it Daled Amis? Dinu kuyav shi'ura b'mishcha, v'yu lo kuyav shi'ura b'mishcha. That they're giving sort of a minimum size for the sukkah, whereas Rabbi Yoshe is not giving a minimum size of a sukkah. He's just saying that the machlokas is based on if the walls reach the schach. Let's say that Rav Huna and Rav Chanan bar Rabba are actually arguing about what's the minimum size of a sukkah. They're not only arguing about in what context do the Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda disagree with regard to the maximum height of a sukkah. No, they're saying more. They're also saying what's the minimum width of a sukkah. The Rav Chanan bar Rabba says that the minimum width of a sukkah is Rosh Ruba v'Shulchano, and if it's larger than Rosh Ruba v'Shulchano, it's a kosher sukkah. Whereas Rav Huna is saying that the minimum width of a sukkah is 4 amas by 4 amas. That if it's less than 4 amas by 4 amas, it's a pasul sukkah. If it's larger than 4 amas by 4 amas, it's a kosher sukkah. The Rav Huna says that the minimum size of a sukkah is 4 amas by 4 amas, whereas Rav Chanan bar Rabba says the minimum size of a sukkah is Rosh Ruba v'Shulchano. Lo. The Gemara says no. No, both Rav Huna and Rav Chanan bar Rabba agree that the minimum size of a sukkah is Rosh Ruba v'Shulchano. The machlokas here between Rav Huna and Rav Chanan bar Rabba is to Marsava b'machzekes Rosh Ruba v'Shulchano plige aval yosem Rosh Ruba v'Shulchano tiv'akol kosher. That Rav Chanan bar Rabba says, look, the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim is specifically when it's Rosh Ruba v'Shulchano, but if it's larger than Rosh Ruba v'Shulchano, there's no longer a machlokas. Whereas my Savar, Rav Huna says, Me Rosh Ruba v'Shulchano Adal Amas Plige, that the machlokas is when the sukkah is less than 4 amas, meaning if it's larger than Rosh Ruba v'Shulchano, it's a kosher sukkah. But if it's less than 4 amas by 4 amas, it would have to be within 20 amas tall. But if it's larger than 20, but if it's larger than 4 amas by 4 amas, then it can even be taller than 20 amas. Meaning, both Rav Huna and Rav Chanan bar Abba agree that for the minimum size of a sukkah is Rosh Haruba v'Shulchan. But the question of what's the maximum height of a sukkah, so then Rav Chanan bar Abba would say, look, as long as it's larger than Rosh Haruba v'Shulchan, it could be taller than 20 amas, where Rav Huna says not so fast. As long as it's less than 4 amas by 4 amas wide, it would have to be within 20 amas according to the Chachamim. Once it's larger than 4 amas by 4 amas, then it can be even taller than 20 amas according to the Chachamim. Fine. Meisvei. We have a kasha. And we're going to kind of end with this kasha, something for us to think about a shtika. We'll pick up with it, sort of, with the teretz tomorrow. But we have a kasha. Sukkah shigavo l'mayla me'esimama psula. That if you have a sukkah that's taller than 20 amas, it's psula. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, what do you mean? It could be taller than 20 amas, it could be 40, 50 amas. And it says, Rabbi Yehuda, I'll prove it to you. Chachamim, I'll prove it to you. That a sukkah can be taller than 20 amas because there's a story. A story with Hilni Amalka in Lud, that she had a sukkah and it was taller than 20 amas. And the rabbis would come in, come out, they would go in and out, and they didn't say anything, which clearly indicates that according to the Chachamim, his sukkah could be taller than 20 amas. They went in and out of Hilni Amalka's sukkah, they didn't say anything. The Chachamim say, what kind of proof is that? Isha Aisof Tu'min Sukkah. Women are Ptura, are exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah. And therefore, even though it was a Apostle Sukkah, they didn't have to say anything because she's allowed to sit in a Apostle Sukkah. Omer Loen. So the Chachamim say, Rabbi Yehuda says, Ma pitom. Valo shiva banim avula. She had 7 sons and they would have to have a kosher Sukkah. And additionally, everything that she did, she only did based on the opinion of the rabbis. And therefore, if her sukkah was more than 20 amas tall, you can be assured that the rabbis were okay with that, and that the rabbis agree with me, says Rabbi Yehuda, that a sukkah is allowed to be more than 20 amas. How come we have to specify, and also everything that she did was only based on the opinion of the rabbis? This is what Rabbi Yehuda is saying to the Chacham that he argues with. Remember, the Chachamim is a relative term. When Rabbi Yehuda says that, when Rabbi Yehuda is arguing with the Chachamim, that's Reb Meir, Reb Yossi, Reb Shimon. When we're talking about the Chachamim with Hilni Amalka, I don't know, when did she live? If she was a queen, I assume that she probably lived during the time of the Beis Hamikdash, which is earlier than Rabbi Yehuda. And those Chachamim are earlier Chachamim. Who knows? Maybe it's like Shmai and Avtayon or something. I don't know. And therefore, what Rabbi Yehuda is saying to his contemporaries is that from this story of Hilni Amalka way back when, and the rabbis were coming in and out of her sukkah, the rabbis of the earlier generations, are coming in and out of her sukkah, clearly they hold like me, says Rabbi Yehuda. So Achikamarlu, this is what Rabbi Yehuda is saying to his contemporaries, Kisomu banu ktanim ayu. If you're going to say, yeah, but Hilni Amalka's sons were young, uktanim p'tur min sukkah, and kitanim, youngins, are patur from sukkah, and that is why the Chacham didn't say anything, because she's p'tur from sukkah, her children are p'tur from sukkah. So Rabbi Yehuda continues and he says, yeah, but even though her sons may have been kitanim, youngins, but if she has 7 sons, one of them had to at least be old enough that he doesn't require his mother anymore, meaning he's reached the age of chinuch, when already he should start doing mitzvahs, to start, getting used to doing mitzvahs. If you're going to say, yeah, but still, the inyan of chinuch of this child who would be sitting in a sukkah just to get, practice doing mitzvahs for when he's actually chayiv to do the mitzvahs, maybe you'll say, okay, but that's only midrabanan that the child would be chayiv. So therefore, says Rabbi Yehuda, everything that she did, she only did api chacham. Therefore, if midrabanan, one of her children had to sit in the sukkah, so then she would make a kosher sukkah even midrabanan. And therefore, says Rabbi Yehuda, from the fact that the chachamim in Hilni Amalka's time were coming in and out of the sukkah, and they were cool with the fact that the sukkah was taller than 20 amas, even though there were children that were chayiv to sit in the sukkah midrabanan. Clearly, says Rabbi Yehuda, the rabbis say that a sukkah is allowed to be, right, they were indicating that a sukkah is allowed to be taller than 20 amas, like I am saying. Now, here comes the kasha. B'shlama l'man da'amr b'shein defanos magias l'schach machlokes. So, from the fact that Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim are clearly arguing in the context of Hilni Amalka's sukkah, so that makes sense if you're Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yoshia, who says that the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim is when the walls do not reach the schach. Because that could make sense in Hilni Amalka's sukkah, that in order for ventilation, the walls didn't reach the schach. And it was taller than 20 amas, the walls didn't reach the schach, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim are deliberating about how tall the status of Hilni Amalka's sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda says, look, you see, Hilni Amalka's sukkah was taller than 20 amas, and he's making that as an argument against the Chachamim who would say, yeah, but it's actually possible. And it makes sense according to Rabbi Yoshia, who says that this machlokas is when the walls don't reach the schach. And that would make sense in the context of Hilni Amalka's sukkah, that there was space towards the top of the walls, between the walls and the schach, for ventilation. Mishum avir, for ventilation. Ella, man da'amar b'sukkah ketana machlokas, chidarka shemalka leisha b'sukkah ketana. And that's the cliffhanger. That's where we're going to leave it. That if you are Rav Huna or Rav Chanan bar Rabba, who say that the machlokas between the Tanakam and Rabbi Yehuda is about a small sukkah, what, you think Hilni Amalka had a tiny little sukkah, and Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim are arguing about if Hilni Amalka's tiny little sukkah was kosher or not? That wouldn't make any sense. To bring as a proof Hilni Amalka's sukkah that it was taller than 20 amas. But in order for that to be a raya, it would have to be a tiny little sukkah. Hilni Amalka is going to have a tiny little sukkah. So therefore, says the Gemara, it makes more sense, like Rabbi Yoshua, who says the machlokas is when the walls do not reach the schach. And that makes sense. Hilni Amalka's sukkah, there was ventilation at the top. And that's the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim about, what exactly happened. The Rabbi Yehuda says, look, the rabbis who were there at the time didn't say anything. So we see that even when there's ventilation, still it could be taller than 20 amas. Alright. Chevra, that was that base of Masechet Sukkah. How do you enjoy it? It's fun, right? Because it's Sukkah stuff. Akoponim. So, we discussed a machlokas, of course, in the Mishnah between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda about the maximum height of a sukkah. Tanakama says 20 amas. Rabbi Yehuda says it could be taller than 20 amas. We saw other things in the Mishnah as well, right? Minimum, right? You have to have at least 3 walls. You have to have more shade in the schach than sun. Okay. Fine. The Gemara asked, how come by Eruvin it says that if the Korah of the Mavui is taller than 20 amas, just lower it, whereas by Sukkah it says it's possible? So we gave 2 answers. One is that Sukkah is the Oraisa, so we say it's appropriate to say possible, whereas Mavui is the Rabbanon, so possible isn't really appropriate, so we say fixed. The other answer is that even by the Oraisas you could say fixed. The only thing is that in our Mishnah there were a lot of different halachas, right? There's what if it's too tall, what if it's too short, what if there's not enough walls. So it's just easier to just say, look, if it's missing any of these factors, it's possible. Fine. Then we learned about the source for sukkah. For the source for the height of the sukkah. We have 3 opinions there. We have Rabbah who says, that the future generation should know about sukkahs, and therefore you have to know that you're sitting in a sukkah, and you can only know that you're in a sukkah if the schach is within 20 amas of the ground. Reb Zera says, that it says that the sukkah will be for shade, and therefore if it's taller than 20 amas, you're not in the shade of the schach, you're in the shade of the walls, and that's no good. Rava says, "Basugusteshvu shivas yomim," that for 7 days you sit in the sukkah, i.e. it has to be a 7-day dwelling, not a permanent dwelling, and therefore if it's within 20 amas, so then you can easily build a temporary dwelling. Once it's already taller than 20 amas, then you're going to have to build it in a more sturdy way with proper foundations and walls, and that's not what we want. So therefore keep it within 20 amas. And then, that's the thrust of our daf. In the second amud, we then gave a few different ukimtas. We tried to figure out who to establish it like. We then saw the case of Hilni Amalka at the end. But again, this was really all within the context of Rabba, Reb Zera, and Rava, and how they understand the source for the maximum height of a sukkah. Chevre, that was the base of Masechet Sukkah. I hope you enjoyed. Cheers.